So this morning, today's panel is titled Thomas Latinus, Thomas Graecus Project. And this panel, unusually, is a presentation of a common project of three scholars, who I will introduce briefly now. Two are present online because they couldn't be here in person, and one who is present here. And then we'll hear two presentations, each followed by questions, and then a period of questions for the larger panel. So the three scholars are first Father Christiaan Kappes, Dean and Professor of Theology at the Byzantine Catholic Seminary of Saints Cyril and Methodius, and he will be presenting first. And secondly, Professor John Demetracopoulos, who is a professor of Byzantine and Scholastic philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Patras, Greece. And he will not be presenting a paper, but he is part of this project, and in fact, coordinator of it, and he will be available for questions as part of the presentation. And lastly, Angelos Zaloumis, a doctoral candidate in Byzantine philology and philosophy of the University of Patras, and the École Pratique des Hautes Études will be speaking. So first, we will hear from Father Kappes. Reverend Dr. Christiaan Kappes currently serves the Byzantine Archieparchy of Pittsburgh as Academic Dean of Saints Cyril and Methodius, Byzantine Catholic Seminary. He received his doctorate in sacred liturgy from Sant'Anselmo, Rome, and his PhD in Eastern Orthodox theology at the University of Thessaloniki, Greece. He has authored numerous peer-reviewed publications, especially the monograph, The Epiclesis Debate at the Council of Florence, Notre Dame Press, 2019, concentrating on a scholastic issue for Latin and Greek authors of the 15th century. Recently, he published a popular revisionist history demonstrating the ancient Greek use of the term and theory of transubstantiation in patristic and Byzantine literature. The Secret History of Transubstantiation from Patristic Pillars Press, 2020. His specializations are in the Greek reception of scholasticism and Latin fathers, as well as Mariology and East-West dogmatic development. So we'll now hear from Father Kappes with his presentation titled Byzantine Thomists, Reception and Rejection of God as Actus Purus after Gregory Palamas, 1296 to 1357. So, Father Kappes.
Thank you very much. I apologize that I cannot be with you in person due to an unfortunate accident with an automobile, so it prevented me from driving, but I'm happy that I am not injured and able to be with you virtually, if not physically. So thank you. I'll go ahead and just begin my paper immediately. Byzantine Thomism was a phenomenon within the Byzantine Empire arising from the translations of about 16 authentic works of Aquinas into classicizing Greek. Publishing of these works began on Christmas 1354. By then, as already long established in historiography, one can speak of a looser Thomist school as already in existence. Since at least AD 1311, theological writers were designating their colleagues as Thomists. And by 1337, we know that Franciscans had taken up this terminology to refer to Dominicans, promoting the official theology and doctor of their order. So it is entirely appropriate to designate certain Byzantine Christians who praised, cited, and imitated the method, arguments, and theological conclusions of Thomas Aquinas on specialized and general theological matters as Thomists. More often, among Byzantine and post-Byzantine authors, we may philologically demonstrate and otherwise highly suspect numerous authors to be latent Thomists who consciously or unconsciously accepted Thomistic phrases, method, and texts, along with the common doctor's theological arguments. This absorption of Aquinas and Orthodox Thomist writers is ever increasing and serves as irrefutable philological evidence that itself is ever increasing. The suspicion that not only were the Greek works of Thomas Aquinas pervasive among both pro and anti-Latin Byzantine or Orthodox authors in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, as well as beyond, but that Aquinas's opera selecta Graece were becoming ubiquitous. Our historiography of Orthodox theology in the Renaissance into the modern period has radically changed in specialist literature, like that produced by members of the Thomas de Aquino Byzantinus project, so that we can say in some areas and on a number of topics that it is a myth that any uncrossable chasm exists between scholastic Latin and Greek Orthodox theology, whether that be from the death of St. Gregory Palamas in 1357 or after the fall of, until the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and even in the post-Byzantine era until the modern period. Quite the opposite is true, as scholasticism formed a bridge between two different theological traditions. The following areas, broached by Byzantines considered today to be approved or saintly Eastern Orthodox authors of the period, are often heavily or moderately under the influence or dominion of Aquinas. Apologetics against Islam, the discussion of theology as scientia, the use and promotion of the genre known as the Quaestio, the question of divine providence and the eternity of the world, the issue of the number and the kinds of the sacraments, and the defense of a moderated rejection of the filioque, along with questions of virtue, vice, sin, and the adoption of transubstantiation, just to name some of the more recently published topics. To this, I plan to add today the late Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox treatment of the essence energies controversy. First, this controversy has returned to both popular and scholarly discussion since the Assumptionist Martin Gigi nearly single-handedly reignited the controversy in the early 1900s. Following in the steps of a fellow Assumptionist editor's attack on Palamism as a spirituality at the turn of the early 19th century, at the turn of the 19th century, 1900. In a successive series of articles, both of these Assumptionists, namely Fathers Bois and Gigi, along with another younger Assumptionist, Guy Chardon later, reignited the controversy so that emigre scholars in France, for example, the famous Losky, and in America, the famous Paul Meyendorff, both investigated and defended their luminary Gregory Palamas against the then neo-Thomist attacks of Martin Gigi. While Losky and Meyendorff poorly understood medieval and Renaissance movements in Thomism, Father Gigi mostly correctly understood the lines in describing 14th century Greek Thomists and Greek Dominicans in their opposition to several versions of Palamism that were known to them in the Byzantine Empire. These versions of Palamism, all available in Greek, tended at their onset to clearly argue for what was called in both Greek and in Latin a distinctio realis in divinis. Such a distinction in Palamas assumed that God was actual, especially after reading St. Augustine's De Trinitate in Greek, but spoke of his essentia as in some sense prior in nature to his actus, so that ousia, or substance, is both conceptually and metaphysically non-concentric with energia, or what might be called attributa or operationes. The first stage of this debate, which does not concern us directly, involved reliance mainly on Hellenic, that is, Aristotle, Plato, Stoicism, Hellenic texts, and Byzantine scholiasts, especially the use of Plotinus and Proclus, as has been philologically published most recently. Thus, anti-Palamite participants can be classed as theologians arguing by only a distinction of reason in the persons and attributes of God, a distinctio rationis, ratiocinatis in divinis. This first generation of anti-Palamites were exclusively Greek Orthodox, like unto Barlaam of Calabria, Gregory Akindanus, and Nicephorus Gregoras, who all relied on Greek authors for the core and the majority of their argumentation to oppose Gregory Palamas. Whereas these authors sometimes employed the metaphysics of pagans like Porphyry in their arguments, it has been philologically shown that Proclus's pagan theology formed the backbone of Palamas's counterpary in a kind of synthesis with Christian theology. What is more, as Martin Gigi was first to mention, Palamas's Neoplatonic system was something like a Scotismus in fieri. The in fieri has been underlined by our fellow participant today, Dr. John Demetracopoulos, because Palamas's content was a merely adapted Proclean thought and rather unoriginal. Palamas even made recourse to Hermeticism, and so increased the mystical bent of an already religious text, of the already religious text of Proclus. To this extent, there may prove to be parallels beyond what have already been published between Bonaventure's adaptation of the Proclean Liber de Causis and Scotus's development of Bonaventure with the works of Palamas. Besides impressionistic and circumstantial evidence, we currently do not have philological grounds for asserting that Palamas's theology was in any way beholden to or in direct opposition to the opera selecta Graece of Thomas Aquinas, available in Byzantium during the last 3 years of Palamas's life. Nonetheless, Palamas unconsciously anticipated what can be called today the argument against Aquinas based upon modal collapse, where the freedom or sovereign will of God is said to be compromised by reducing will to intellect and intellect to will in divinis, whether by asserting the sameness and identity really in re, or by denying that the distinction in the semantic content of each term is really based in re, but rather is based upon applying distinctions co ad nos to imperfectly speak about the ipse esse subsistens, which is beyond the categories and beyond the literal potentia actus opposition of ens and actu that is treated in metaphysics. This was best illustrated in a recorded debate with the anti-Palamite Nicephorus Gregoris shortly before Palamas's death. If, as just mentioned, the first stage of the debate from 1333 to 1354 involved only Greek authors, with the addition of using St. Augustine of Hippo in Greek from about 1345 onwards. The second stage of the debate began by Demetrius Kydones, born 1323, thereabouts, died about 1397, and his brother Prochorus Kydones, born around 1330, and died either in 1369 or 1371. They translated patristic and scholastic texts from Latin into classicizing Greek for both educational and polemical purposes. The result of this translation was to make figures like the then patriarch Philotheos Kokkinos, who is today a celebrated liturgical publisher. He is a well-known Palamite patriarch and a theologian in his own right, but they made him at least address Augustine and scholasticism obliquely from what has been gleaned from his opposition to the brothers Kydones. More importantly, other authors, more well-known perhaps among us, like Nicholas Cabasilas, who is a recently declared saint of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and about whom we'll hear more with the presentation of Angelos Zaloumis in a minute. He became directly acquainted with and solicitous to cite and use positively the Greek translations of Aquinas's works in the 1350s. Again, I should like to emphasize, since many are more medieval specialists or systematic philosophers and theologians, the importance of demonstrating philologically and not just impressionistically in the last 20 years, and in some cases only in the last few years, the direct dependence of celebrated Orthodox authors on Thomas in a positive way and imitating his style, his language, as well as his theological conclusions. This is all new. For example, the Greek Orthodox layman Nicholas Cabasilas used positively Aquinas in his adoption, like many Palamites, used the adoption of the scholastic Quaestio to resolve philosophical and theological problems. Furthermore, John Demetracopoulos, present with us, has shown his explicit and latent use of Aquinas Graecus within his own opera, not to mention citations from Augustine and perhaps even from Peter Lombard's sentences. Additionally, after the introduction of the disputed question of the Immaculate Conception into Byzantine historiography by the Orthodox Nicephorus Callistus Xanthopoulos around 1347 AD, Both Demetrius Kidanes and Nicholas Cabasilas wrote in favor of Mary's Immaculate Conception, if using different arguments, in material opposition to Thomas Aquinas, whom they otherwise tended to use approvingly. As an aid, there is even evidence that the Franciscan Francis Mayron was cited by Cabasilas when imitating the exact same recognition of the Summa Theologiae Tertia Pars, Quaestio 27, Articulus 3 ad 3. And what I'll do is I'll go now to my, what do you want to say here, slide, which does actually provide an evidence of how this progressed. We do know that Mayron was available in Byzantium at different times, was translated in part or in whole into Greek. We only have evidence right now for fragments. But what you'll see here up on the screen, just to present it to you briefly, is that Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae famously argues against the Immaculate Conception, but in one of his responsios, his ad 3, he actually happens across a Greek argument that talks about the use of purification. Again, the classical argument was from Lombard sentences that Mary has something like original sin or the reliquiae peccati, some sort of dregs of sin, as a result of the fact that she was in some sense purified at the Annunciation. This was a misunderstood text from John of Damascus that was available in the universities, and texts of Peter Lombard in the university. And it was thought that the purification of Mary at the Annunciation was a commitment to Mary having something to be cleansed or purified. And this became, I would argue, ubiquitous in the universities. Whereas Aquinas found in his objection that Dionysius uses the sense of purification in a non-sinful sense. And he cites that here in his objection, though he does not apply it to Mary, he does apply it to the angels. What we see later is that Francis Mayron, in his own very famous Conflatus, rearranges Thomas's statement to argue for the Immaculate Conception and accurately understands that one of the Greek uses of purification actually means to take something already holy and simply provide it with more grace or more merit. And so here he rearranges that. And what we see is that this exactly parallels the arguments used by Nicholas Cabasilas in his Marian homily on the Nativity of Mary, which we cannot find thanks to our modern search engines like the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae. By exclusion, we can exclude the vocabulary and the argument from any other known Byzantine texts. And the Thesaurus does represent a good number of texts, certainly many, if not most of the edited texts, but not necessarily all. So what we therefore can see here is just one example of how pervasive scholasticism is, and Thomas Aquinas is, whether directly, or in this case, in a reformed way by Francis Mayron, how useful he is to Byzantine authors. Now, continuing on, Nicholas Cabasilas and Demetrius Kidanes were friends and correspondents who spread Aquinas's theological method and arguments among their Greek Orthodox contemporaries. This includes Nilus Cabasilas, uncle to Nicholas Cabasilas, and Emperor John VI Catacuzenus, who both reacted to, but also employed Aquinas for their theological purposes. For example, Emperor John relied upon Aquinas for his own metaphysical articulation of the essence attributes distinction along the lines of what he had read and cited from Aquinas. That is, something like a distinctio rationis rationate. This first period of translation activity, again, from 1354 to 1368, was followed by a formal condemnation by the official synod of the Orthodox Church of Prochorus Kidanes, about 7 years Demetrius's junior, for publicly versus privately criticizing Palamas and his theology. As the result of learning Latin and translating patristic and scholastic works, for example, Aquinas's Secundae Secundae and selections of the Tertia Pars, and even Hervaeus Natalis's commentary on Lombard Sententia. Again, this is just portions, not the whole thing. Prochorus opposed vehemently Palamite doctrine of what was called uncreated light of the divinity, which light was equated to one among the other attributes really distinct, though inseparable from the divine essence, according to Palamite theology. Procrus vehemently argued against Palamite theologians by emphasizing the doctrine of God in Aquinas as Actus Purus, and that God can be distinguished by neither his Actus Essendi in Essentia, nor by designating God as ens in actu. God is nothing other than deity and its personal relations. Demetrius was later to second his brother's promotion of Thomistic metaphysics after his brother was accused of heresy and eventually condemned in 1368. Prior to this, Byzantines were exposed to Aquinas' clear notion of actus essendi in Greek. In the Prima Pars, question 3, Aquinas discusses God as his own essence and his own existence. In the statement that Aquinas makes, quote, I answer that God is not only his own essence, as shown in the preceding article, but also his own existence, end quote. The appearance of the non-Greek terminus technicus actus essendi made its way into Demetrius Kyranes' Summa Theologiae as follows, and then you should see on your screen. To the left, the Summa Theologiae Quaestio 3, Articulus 4 ad 2. Ad secundum dicendum quad esse duplicitur dicitur, uno modo significat actum essendi, alio modo significat compositionem propositionis, quam anima ad invenit conjugens predicatum subjecto, primo igitur modo. And then you'll see here that the term is translated by Demetrius innovatively into e to ine energia. And of course, I just provide the English translation. I think it's a standard one here to the right. So we can see to be can mean either of two things. It can mean the act of essence, or it can mean the composition of a proposition affected by the mind and joining a predicate to a subject. Taken to be, in the first sense, we cannot understand God's existence or his essence, but only in the second sense, we can know that this proposition which we form about God when we say God is true, and this we know from his effects. Prior to this prohibition by Aquinas of speaking about God as having literally essence and existence, Gregory Palamas had already summarized Byzantines objecting in a like manner to this kind of a distinction in the same verbal terms when Palamas debated a fellow anti-Latin Byzantine who opposed Palamas's theology. You'll see that he sort of anticipates this debate before the introduction of Thomas Aquinas. He says here, prostitutis epi tis theas usias catautus I thea miden dieni nochen energia, que to energin tu ine, ton theon uc an ii parilagmenon ud oppostiun ucun, which can be translated as, in addition, since, according to them, meaning his opponents, divine energy does not at all differ from the divine essence, and since God's existence does not differ at all from his acting. This is what Palamas opposes, that there is a party pre-existing the translations of Thomas Aquinas who deny a real distinction between God's attributes and his essence, and here, even the act of existing in God's essence. And so Palamas, of course, is promoting something that is quite radically different. Continuing on, while nearly all discussion by Palamas concentrated on the question of the putatively eternal attribute of divine light or some other attribute like the divine will or intellect, Palamas had in his mind the language of the Sixth Ecumenical Council, though, as I have found, he fails to cite it in an authentic text in his own works. But nonetheless, he had committed himself to nominally and correctly mentioning the fact that the Sixth Ecumenical Council makes a distinction between the divine nature and human nature of the one Christ, requiring that the divine nature, physis, have its own operation, energia, and the human nature, physis, have its own operation, energia. While Thomists in Europe and in Byzantium qualified this language by stripping the notion of energia or attributum or operatio from being something equivalent to Aristotle's energia or kinesis, that is, to something like the action used in the Aristotelian texts and commentaries on categorical being, Palamas designated this attribute of the divine nature as something like a divine accident, symvevikos pos. This language lent itself to impugn Palamas. The net result encouraged the newly educated Byzantine Thomists, namely Demetrius and Procrus Kydones, about whom we've been speaking, to oppose Palamite formulations of God ad intra, to formulations of God's ad intra relations and attributes in Palamite terms. Palamas's doctrine was understood in its verbal formulation to mean several things by different Byzantines. Here are just some examples that can be combined or separated author by author. Some Byzantines actually took Palamas to mean that the essence-energy distinction is equivalent to having potentia and actualitas, a crude but rare concession. 2, some took him to mean that God possesses power and will, where Aquinas will be received as modally collapsing these in re. 3, some Byzantines consider God possessing essence, which is not definitionally his will. This represents another form of the modal collapse argument based more on the logical order instead of the metaphysical order. The general outlines of the situation can be summarized in the work of John Demetracopoulos' groundbreaking study, which I might mention is book length. It's about 100 pages on the positions of all the major characters discussing the issue from our period of talking today, which is 1357 until 1472. Palamites tended to fall into 3 camps in relation to Aquinas' 2 well-known summae. 1, they were metaphysical anti-Thomists. An example is the crude Nicephorus Angelicudes. 2, more of them were metaphysically ambiguous theologians. We've already mentioned Philotheos Coccinus, for example, and Emperor John. 3, theologians who compromise or attenuate Palamism to Thomism. An example of this is Mark of Ephesus and a lesser-known theologian, Joseph Bryennius. Finally, there was a particular outlier who might be a name known among those who are attending today more than the rest, and that is that there is a theologian by the name of Gennadius Scholarius who adopted Scotism to reconcile the extremes. I have already published papers showing that Gennadius Scholarius, otherwise known as George Scholarius, made employment of the scotistically inclined Thomist Hervaeus Natalis. So even here, he sees himself both contextually and as far as we're concerned as historians of Thomism, as a Thomist. So he would have been considered a Thomist in his own day. He considered himself a Thomist. Today, we might apply more strict requirements for him to be denominated such. But he used the Thomist Hervaeus Natalis in the order of metaphysical logic, that is talking about ens rationis, and he used Hervaean arguments to justify that God, as ens infinitum, can be argued to admit simpliciter simplex attributes to really exist in an infinite mode along with God's divine essence without any real composition. Furthermore, I have already emphasized and published Scholarius's use of Bonaventure of Bagnoregio and the 14th century Scotist Francis of Meron to argue that there is a compatibility of Palamism with the Thomist typology of distinctions. Scholarius does this by developing the virtual distinction, distinctio virtualis, and distinction of reason, distinctio rationis cum fundamento in re, as some 14th century Thomists did, and as some Franciscan authors argued could be done as well. The point here is that Scholarius, though professedly and sincerely Thomist in his dispositions and affections, was very much in the line of a scholastic eclecticism that represented many 14th and 15th century Thomists on matters of logic and metaphysics. What is new to present today, however, in addition to simply noting that indeed anti-Palamites like the brothers Kydones and the 15th century Greek Dominican Manuel Graecus from time to time opposed Palamites for allowing God opposed Palamites for not allowing God to be only Actus Purus, but something like ens in actu. What is new is that we can even see that in Gennadius Scholarius's synopsis, or his Summa of the Summa, if you will, which he composed by reworking for the greater part Demetrius Kydones' Greek translation of the Summa Contra Gentiles, that Gennadius distorts, if you will, Aquinas' statements and Aquinas' commitments ultimately in order to accommodate the Summa Contra Gentiles to his Palamite sensitivities. Of course, this is in 1458. He's definitively broken from the Latin Church. He's already written some critical comments that one of the few areas where Thomas cannot be totally Orthodox, meaning Eastern Orthodox, happens to be on the essence energies topic. And so what we'll see here to the left is that Aquinas' original Summa Contra Gentiles says, esse enim actu in uno quoque est bonum ipsius, sed Deus non solum est ens actu, sed est ipsum suum esse. Of course, we see that the English translation provided is something like, God is not only ens in actu, but he is his very own esse. We see that Cedones faithfully and correctly translates this. He says, "O de theos estin umonon on energia, ala ke aufto to ine auftu," which you should be able to see that the, I am blocking my own translation here with a piece of the, what do you call this, Zoom, but then you'll see, I have it here on my paper. He says, to agathon aftu o theos estin umonon on energia ala ke aufto to ine auftu. And then we see that Gennadius Scholarius changes this to o theos de ke energia estin ke energia ke auftos to ine auftu. So there's a clear change from, yet God is not merely a being and act, but he is his very own act of being, to God is his own goodness, because in each being esse and actu is its own goodness. But God is both in actu and act, and he is the act of his own being. Here we can see that there's quite a different rendering of Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles to accommodate Palamism, which is a very interesting development. Conclusions. In this short summary about Byzantine Thomism in Byzantium on the question of God as only Actus Purus, we can see that Aquinas' assertion that God is Actus Purus was not a central point of contention in the 14th century debates among Greek-speaking and Greek-reading Byzantines. We saw that there is a single mention that I was able to find in Palamas of something like this terminology, anticipating it, but not quite Aquinas' exact rendering of Actus Essendi. However, at the onset of the 15th century, it became a more prominent point of contention between Thomists and Palamites. On one side, writers such as Greek Dominicans, Manuel Calecus and Andrew Chrysoberges, both writing for our purposes mainly in the 1400s, provoked reactions to Thomism in the person of Mark of Ephesus and Gennadius Scholarius. This did actually flesh itself out at the Council of Florence, in which there were some small Palamite Thomist battles during the council, but which did not really result in anything, since the Emperor and Pope Eugene at the time kind of put the kibosh on those blowing up and taking over the council. So Mark of Ephesus, the only non-signatory of the Council of Florence, and Gennadius Scholarius, a theological paradis at the council, eventually both opposed the semantic and the metaphysical identity of essentia with attributum. The greatest mind at the time was in the areas of theology and philosophy was probably Gennadius Scholarius. One could even argue him to rival his Latin contemporaries in understanding anything from Thomas to certainly Greek theology. But Gennadius Scholarius simply used Thomistic and Scotistic common strategies to reconcile Palamas to Orthodox Christianity, but thereafter he even rewrote, as we have just seen, his edition of the Summa Contra Gentiles to accommodate Palamism without, in this moment, impugning Thomas Aquinas in the text. This does not mean that Scholarius elsewhere refrained from making some few comments on the matter that admit that Aquinas' stance on the divine essence and attributes was problematic for Eastern Orthodox. But it does mean that Thomas Aquinas, as has often been shown and quoted, was the princeps theologorum for Gennadius Scholarius, and that he continued in any manner that he could to promote Aquinas, other than those one or two major areas in which he found he could not reconcile Aquinas's clear meaning with the official stance of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Kappes, for your presentation. So now we're going to have a time for questions for Father Kappes, and then there'll be another time for questions at the end for the entire panel. So if you have a question, I'm going to go around with the microphone. Please raise your hand.
Thank you very much for the helpful presentation. I had a quick citation question. You said that Mark of Ephesus attenuated Palamism to Thomism, and I was going to ask for a text reference on that. Would be helpful.
Well, we just happen to have the author of the citations that were discovered here with John Demetracopoulos. The article is called Palamas Transformed. I would imagine, John, to put you on the spot, you actually have memorized the actual texts in which there's two versions of Mark of Ephesus, a harder distinction version and a softer distinction version. He obviously has differences in his thought. Which one would you say is the attenuated version, John?
Well, Mark actually adopts Aquinas' analogia entities. The fundamental difference between Mark's Palamism and Palamas's Palamism is that Mark Eugenicus does not accept that there is a real distinction between two things, so to speak, between essence and energy, which according to Palamas are separated from each other in an infinite distance. Mark Eugenicus says that it's because of our composite nature that we can understand God as a composite being, although we do know that he is not composite.
Do you recall the text offhand in which he mostly argues that? Is it his Analytics?
Yeah, there is a dissertation by Marios Pilavakis, which was defended in 1987, which is a critical editio princeps of the two treatises by Mark Eugenicus against Manuel Kalekas on the essence and energy issue.
And I would add, I have a PDF of that for the questioner, and John's article is readily available. So if you want both of those, I can send those to you.
Yes. So, but I mean, the problem is that this dissertation is still unpublished, and it contains an editio princeps of these works. So this is my source, and there are some minor texts by Mark Eugenicus where one can see that he tries to avoid the rude way, I would say, rude against God, the rude way in which Palamas tries to establish a real distinction between essence and energies. I will try to share with you my paper.
Okay, thank you. Maybe towards the end, if you find it, we can just look at it in the common questions period. Any other questions? Okay, let's proceed to the next presentation.
Thank you.
Let's thank Father Kappes again. Angelos Zaloumis is currently working on a joint PhD at the University of Patras and the École Pratique des Hautes Études of Paris. The topic of his thesis is a critical edition of Demetrios Kadone's Greek translation of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, Secunda Secundae, and a study of its late Byzantine reception. Apart from this, he's worked on the Summa Contra Gentiles as a source of John VI's Cantacuzeno's moral intellectualism in his polemical treatises. In addition, his interests focus on late Byzantine patristic Florilegia and Augustinus Graecus. During his doctoral studies, he has been a research fellow at the Hellenic Institute of Byzantine and Post-Byzantine Studies during the 2021-2022 academic year, and a visiting fellow at the École Française de Rome, the Maison Française d'Oxford, the Thomists Institute of the University of Cologne, and the Department of Byzantine and Modern Greek Studies of the University of Vienna. So he will be presenting on Τελεία ἀγάπη versus καθαρά θεωρία, the reception of Thomas Aquinas' views on the possibility of achieving ultimate happiness in this life in Nicholas Cabasilas' De Vita in Christo and its latent purpose. Please welcome Mr. Zaloumis.
Reverend Father, esteemed colleagues, it is a great honor to join all of you in celebrating the 800th anniversary of the birth of Thomas Aquinas. This event is not merely a commemoration of a towering figure in the history of philosophy and theology, but a testament to the continued relevance of his thought. I'm truly grateful to be among such esteemed scholars, each contributing to the rich and ongoing conversation around Aquinas' enduring influence, and have the opportunity to talk about Thomas and the reception of his thought in late Byzantium. Before proceeding to the core of my presentation, I would like to first briefly outline the biographical background of Nicholas Cabasilas and provide an overview of the structure of the De Vita in Christo. Nicholas Cabasilas Chamaetos was born in Thessalonica between 1319 and 1323 into a distinguished aristocratic family. While his father bore the surname Chamaetos, Nicholas chose to use his mother's more renowned name, Cabasilas. His uncle Nicholas Nilos Cabasilas later became Metropolitan of Thessalonica after Gregory Palamas' death. In his youth, Nicholas became involved with Hesychast circles, a spiritual movement influenced by figures such as Gregory Palamas and Isidore Bouhiras, who was a disciple of Gregory of Sinai. Bouhiras was also a teacher to both Nicholas and his childhood friend, Dimitrios Kidonis. This movement aimed to promote spirituality among lay people regardless of social status. It is speculated that Nicholas's mother and Dimitrios' sister were also involved. A letter Nicholas wrote to his father from Constantinople indicates that he had a spiritual father in Thessalonica, Dorotheos Vlatis, a Hesychast priest. Between 3035 and 3040, Nicholas studied in Thessalonica under his uncle's guidance, later continuing his education in Constantinople in subjects such as grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, law, and astronomy, aligning him with the humanist renaissance of the Palaiologan era. In 1341, following Emperor Andronikos III's death, a civil war broke out. Meanwhile, the Zealots, a popular movement, took control of Thessalonica from 1342 to 1349. Though Nicholas was part of the aristocracy, he played a mediating role during these conflicts. In 1347, Nicholas was called to Constantinople by John VI Cantacuzeno's at the same year with Kidonis, marking the start of a close relationship. He then accompanied Gregory Palamas to Thessalonica later that year, accompanying him on Mount Athos after Palamas was barred from entering the city. In December 1354, as John VI left the imperial throne for the monastery of the Mangana, both Dimitrios Kidonis and Nicholas Cabasilas accompanied him. From this point onwards, he escapes the traditional historical sources. He spent his final years in Constantinople writing his two major works, a commentary on the Divine Liturgy and the Life in Christ, which cemented his legacy as a leading theologian. Nicholas Cabasilas likely passed away sometime around 1391 or 1397 to 1398, shortly after the death of his lifelong friend Demetrios Kydonis. The Life in Christ is divided into 7 books. In Book 1, Cabasilas presents the life in Christ that is communicated through the holy mysteries, baptism, chrismation, Eucharist. In Book 2, Cabasilas discusses how baptism contributes to life in Christ. Then in Book 3, he describes what completion does chrismation bring to life in Christ. And in Book 4, Cabasilas explains what completion does the Eucharist give to life in Christ. In Book 5, he moves on to discuss what completion does the consecration of the altar bring to life in Christ. Book 6, he describes how we can preserve the life in Christ that we have received from the Holy Sacraments. And in Book 7, he analyzes what happens to a man who has been initiated and who, through his fervor, maintains the grace he has received. Before I proceed with presenting you my own findings, let us see what has been previously said with regard to the reception of Thomas Aquinas through the Greek translations of the Summa Contra Gentiles and Summa Theologia by Cabasilas in the De Vita in Christo. Already in the 1970s, in his only 6 pages long article Autoportrait d'un sage du XIVe siècle, Jean Gouillard provided the first glimpses into the probable Thomistic influence in Cabasilas' treatise, along with St. Augustine and even Anselm. In this point, I want to state that I will be using the critical edition of the De Vita in Christo by Professor Concordo, the English translation of Carmelo Catanzaro, the text of the Summa Theologia and the Summa Contra Gentiles from the online version of the Ditio Leonina found on corpusthomisticum.org, and the English translation of Thomas's works made by the Aquinas Institute as found on the website. In particular, Gouillard quotes this passage from Book 7, which I will give in a resume. The joy we experience from God is immeasurable, as it is proportional to his greatness, which surpasses everything else. Our desire for him is vast and aligned with his infinite goodness. While human desire is limited by our nature, nothing in creation fully satisfies or equals God. Even if we possess all good things, riches, plutos, we would still yearn for more, as only God can truly fulfill the soul's capacity for joy and contentment. For Gouillard, Cabasilas' views echo Thomas Aquinas from Summa Theologia Prima Secunda, question 2, especially Article 1, whether man's happiness consists in wealth. In particular, Gouillard considers the influence to be from objection 3, since the desire for the sovereign good never fails, it seems to be infinite. Reply to objection 1, where Thomas says that all material things obey money, but we should take our estimation of human goods not from the foolish but from the wise. And reply to objection 3, that this desire for wealth is infinite otherwise than the desire for the sovereign good, summum bonum. For the more perfectly the sovereign good is possessed, the more it is loved and other things despised. Because the more we possess it, the more we know it. Hence it is written, they that eat me shall yet hunger. Furthermore, Professor Demetracopoulos, in his book review of 2010, A Code d'Orient Résonance d'Ouest, in respect of Carmelo Giuseppe Cotincello's La Théologie Byzantine et sa Tradition, demonstrated that the very first sentence of the De Vita in Christo, the one in bold, is in fact, quote, a latent yet close reproduction of some lines from Demetrios Kydonis' translation of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles, Book 3, Chapter 63-7. The contemplation of truth begins in this life, but will be consummated in the life to come, while the active and civic life does not transcend the limits of this life. I believe that Cabasilas' wording is so profound that there need be no further explanation whether Thomas Aquinas' view on the possibility of achieving the vision of God in the present life, thereby attaining full happiness in this life, as well as the sharp distinction between the status vi and the status patria, a plainly Thomistic view, are what Cabasilas adopts. In contrast, if one wishes to look for such themes or terms, perfection, beatitude, or happiness in this life, in the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, they will quickly realize that the results are limited, and many of them are in fact whatever Greek translations of Thomas are already on the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, especially through Scholaris' abridgments and of course Cabasilas. And now that I presented what other scholars have already discovered and written about Thomistic influences in the De Vita in Christo, I shall proceed to present what I believe I found through my research so far, focusing on Cabasilas' last book of the De Vita in Christo, Book 7. After having discussed the importance of the holy sacraments and the divine grace that we have received, Cabasilas goes straight to the let us leave other things aside and look at the will of the soul itself. In this both the goodness and wickedness of a man consist, his true health and his sickness, in short, his life or death. The blessed life consists in this, that this will should be good and tend to God alone. To this end, God built the world for us and made laws. Further, it belongs to a right disposition that one assent to right doctrines and believe concerning God that which is true. In short, the whole law, says God, is given for the sake of love. Love, however, is a virtue of the will. Love, a virtue of the will. I'm sure to some of you this language and this terminology may sound familiar. Thomas, in Summa Theologiae Secunda, question 24, on the subject of charity, Article 1, whether the will is the subject of charity, states, the object of charity is the good, which is also the object of the will. Therefore, charity is in the will as its object. And this is further explained in the Responsio. First of all, this language that Thomas uses when discussing the virtue of charity using philosophical Aristotelian terminology to describe a theological virtue, again, is not to be found in the Greek tradition. If only one looks for the terms charity, virtue, and will, either as voulisis, thelisis, or even economy, as Cabasilas does, and of course in the context charity discussed, not just a coincidence of words, the only results will be the unfinished edition of Chironis' translation of the Secunda, Nicholas Cabasilas, and a couple of other late Byzantine theologians who were influenced by Thomas. Furthermore, the fact that charity is directly linked and determined by our belief of the true doctrines and the fulfillment of God's law, faith, is of course clearly expressed in Thomas. In question 4, Article 7. What is interesting, perhaps a mere coincidence, I believe, the phrase love is a virtue of the will, caritas est virtus voluntatis, is found in almost the same wording in another work of Thomas, the Quaestiones disputate de virtutibus, question 2, on charity, Article 3, whether charity is the form of the virtues, reply to objection 13. There we read, in virtutibus autum theologicis, quae sunt circa Deum virtus voluntatis licet caritas, informat virtutem intellectus licet fidem. If we just change the sequence of the words by placing the word caritas before virtus voluntatis and turn licet to est, we have exactly Cabasilas' phrase. Of course, this work was not translated into Greek, as far as we know, and I do not claim that the source of Cabasilas is the Virtutibus at all. I just want to point out that the essence of Thomas' discussion on charity, with regard to the will, is found coincidentally in another work of his, of course, and Cabasilas, who seems to have read Thomas and received the essence of his teachings. Cabasilas carries on and states that the one thing that we as humans are responsible to do, quote, is the keeping of the commandments of him who is able to reward and to punish hereafter. The keeping of his laws all depends on the will. There are the words laid up for those who reverence the lawgiver, and likewise penalties for those who ignore him. To do this pertains to free will. Nobody would incur either reward or punishment for things which are entirely involuntary. Therefore, if we examine the will of him who lives in accordance with God, we shall find the blessed life shining forth in it. Cabasilas repeats this view near the end of Book 7. For this is to abide in love. All blessedness consists in this. To abide in love is to abide in God, and for him who abides in him to possess him, for it says, he who abides in love abides in God, and God abides in him. And that's the most important part. This happens, says Cabasilas, when we have love firmly fixed in the will and arrive at that through the commandments and keep the laws of him whom we love. As I to repeat is question secunda, question 4, article 7. Of course, in these passages, it would be a bit hard for one to try and edify purely Thomistic influences in the topic, which is in the core of Christian doctrine, of course, that is to love God by keeping his commandments. But of course, his ideas are also discussed by Thomas in the secunda, question 2, article 5, question 22, question 44, for instance. However, a few paragraphs below the penultimate passage I showed you, it's this one here, that love is a virtue of the will. Cabasilas says something which initially puzzled me when I first read it. Since antiquity, there is a clear distinction between pleasure and pain, sorrow, idoni, odini, which are contrary. But Cabasilas discussing the fullness or excess of the will, hyperbole, namely pleasure and pain, states, quote, "It is not necessary then that those who are concerned about the blessed life contemplate these things, when it is possible thereby to learn both what that life is and in what its happiness consists of. Since sorrow precedes joy to the extent that joy is the fruit of sorrow, for he says, those who mourn shall be comforted. So sorrow preceding joy." Initially I tried to look up for any relevant reference in the Theology to no avail. Then I turned to Chidoni's translation of the Summe, and I found that in the Prima Secunda, question 35, of pain or sorrow in itself, article 3, Thomas discusses whether sorrow of pain is contrary to pleasure. We read in the first objection, "It would seem that sorrow is not contrary to pleasure, for one or two contraries is not the cause of the other, but sorrow can be the cause of pleasure. For it is written, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Therefore, they are not contrary to one another." The text in bold is almost exactly the same with the passage from the Vita in Christo. But since this is a counter-argument, an objection, which Thomas almost always refutes, and both in the Sed Contra and the Responsio, Thomas is clear. Pleasure and sorrow, pain, are contrary to one another. However, in his reply to objection 1, Thomas has this to say, "Nothing hinders one contrary causing the other accidentally, and thus sorrow can be the cause of pleasure." And further, he mentions the two ways this can happen, and continues by saying, "In each of these ways, the sorrows of the present life lead us to the comfort of the future life." Therefore, Thomas agrees that with the condition that this is per accidens, sorrow can be the cause of pleasure, exactly as Cabasilas maintains. And I will now proceed to the last instance of Cabasilas' reception of Thomas Aquinas, in particular Summa Theologiae secunda. Near the end of his treatise, Cabasilas returns to what he stated in the beginning of the 7th book. I quote, "Thus it appears in all things that the blessed life consists in the perfection of the will in the present life. Since man possesses mind, intellect, and will, it is necessary that he who is to be completely blessed should agree with God in both these things and be conjoined to him, by his mind in pure contemplation of him, by his will by perfectly loving him. However," says Cabasilas, "in the present life, those who are blessed are perfect in relation to God in respect of their will, but not yet with respect to the activity of their intellect. One may find perfect love in them, but by no means pure contemplation of God, by no means. If, however, that which is in the future is present with them, while they yet live in the body, they already experience the price, yet not continually or perfectly, since this life does not permit it." I believe that Cabasilas' view is so clearly expressed that it would not be necessary to show you where exactly does Thomas Aquinas claim that there cannot be pure contemplation and thus perfection of the mind in this life, in hac vita, because of our mortal and finite nature, but since I have to substantiate my claim with evidence, I will quote the Dr. Angelicus in the Summa Theologiae, Prima Secunda, question 3, article 2, reply to objection 4. In man, according to their present state of life, the final perfection is in respect of an operation whereby man is united to God. But this operation neither can be continual, nor consequently is it on one only, because operation is multiplied by being discontinued. Furthermore, he says, consequently, in the present life, in as far as we fall short of the unity and continuity of that operation, so do we fall short of perfect happiness. And furthermore, in the Prima Secunda, question 5, article 3, in the Responsio, a certain participation of happiness can be had in this life, but perfect and true happiness cannot be had in this life with regard to contemplation. And toward the end of the Responsio, Thomas says, from a consideration of the specific nature of happiness, namely the vision of the divine essence, which man cannot obtain in this life, as was shown in the first part, question 12, article 11, it is evident that none can attain true and perfect happiness in this life. But what about charity? Again, Thomas, when asked about whether charity can be perfect in this life, maintains that, Secunda, question 24, article 8, on the part of the person who loves, charity is perfect when he loves as much as he can. And in this life, this can happen when man makes an earnest endeavor to give his time to God and divine things, while scorning other things except in so far as the needs of the present life demand, and gives his whole heart to God habitually, namely, by neither thinking nor desiring anything contrary to the love of God. To sum up, let's put in a nutshell what are the main ideas that Cabasilas expresses in his conclusions. Those who live in Christ can only achieve perfection in this life only through charity, and this perfection comes by obeying God's commandments, in particular those that Christ mentioned as the two most important when asked which is the first of all commandments. You shall love your Lord, the Lord your God, with all your heart, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And here I put these ideas in a small paragraph. And I think that is a clear and concise representation of Cabasilas' conclusion of his work, De Vita in Christo, the life in Christ. In fact, this is how Thomas Aquinas almost concludes his Summa Theologiae Secunda, by discussing the state of perfection in this life, starting in question 184. And in particular, Article 2, whether anyone can be perfect in this life, and Article 3, whether in this life perfection consists in the observance of the commandments or of the counsels. Is this a coincidence? To conclude, I will give some brief reference about the latent purpose of this use of Thomas in the part of Cabasilas. In the past, the issue whether Nicholas Cabasilas was a Palamite, an anti-Palamite, or an autonomous thinker has been an issue of debate. One factor that had contributed towards considering Cabasilas a supporter of hesychasm was that researchers tended to confuse him with his uncle, Nilos Cabasilas, whose baptismal name was Nicholas, and many of the manuscripts are using this name. Among those who pointed out that Nicholas Cabasilas did not share all of Palamas' views are Professor Ioannis Polemis and Professor John Demetracopoulos, who is here with us online. The first instance where Cabasilas seems to turn against certain views of Palamas is a short treatise of Cabasilas, the De Rationis Valore, or Arguments of Those Who Would Prove That the Wisdom Based on Reason is a Vain Thing, refutation of the arguments of this kind, which actually follows the structure of a Quaestio. There, in fact, Cabasilas refutes Palamas' argument against the value of secular wisdom in the triads 1 and 2. As Polemis had demonstrated, even the wording and stylistic similarities between the two texts are striking. Furthermore, Cabasilas in Book 4 of the De Vita in Christo, after exalting this mystery as the highest of all in terms of the degree of union with God that it bestows upon the believer, explains, we do not receive some rays, but the Son of Righteousness himself, so that we're penetrated by him and become one spirit with him. This, according to Professor Demetracopoulos, and he can further explain if you have a question about it, is a refutation of Palamas, who claimed that one man receives with the Holy Communion is the rays and light of God, and not the full God, as happens with the inner prayer and the illumination through an experience of the uncreated light, I will give here an example that, in my opinion, explains why Cabasilas emphatically maintains that only through charity and the love of God can man achieve perfection, and comes actually not from Palamas himself, but a Palamite who wrote about the same time with Cabasilas, Κάλισος Αγγελικούδης, in an oration 16 in the critical edition, concerning the spiritual warfare and the sacred stillness, according to it, chapter 15, the closing actually, concluding remarks, concerning divine love more thoroughly from the beginning until the end, maintains that if the intellect is not the one properly presiding over charity, then not only is it irrational and dark, but it is also not right to call it true charity. For just as a newborn infant is human by nature, but would not simply be called human due to its incompleteness, so much more, even if the unaffected state can stir the disposition of charity, and the other things I've already mentioned, yet it remains naturally fleeting in the soul, such that it is often altered by even the smallest causes, before the mind has reached the vision of God and the attainable union through the intellectual light. At that point, the intellect will have strong roots, so to speak, of love, and love would arrive later at its perfection according to the measure granted to it when it is illuminated and bathed in divine rays. In concluding the discussion of the reception of Thomas Aquinas in the Byzantine world, particularly through the translations of Demetracopoulos, we are reminded of the profound importance of critical editions in reshaping our understanding of intellectual history. The ongoing efforts of projects such as the Thomas Aquinas Byzantinus exemplify this scholarly endeavor, making the Greek translations of Aquinas accessible to audiences. By preserving and critically editing this text, we not only safeguard historical dialogue between Latin and Byzantine traditions, but also allow new generations to engage with the complexities of Byzantine Thomism. Through such meticulous scholarship, we continue to uncover the layers of influence that Thomas, the most excellent, according to George Colarios, the muse who is more venerable than Aristotle and Plato, had, in the words of Demetracopoulos, directing our efforts towards establishing the Thomistic influence in Byzantine thought, a testament to the enduring vitality of this text in shaping our shared intellectual heritage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zaloumis. So now, Mr. Zaloumis will entertain questions. If anyone has a question.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is just a clarification. You said that wisdom from reason is prideful, but you were quoting someone and it was quick. And I was just...
Wisdom?
Wisdom from reason is prideful.
Prideful?
Yeah, I thought, but then, like basically then you went to the quote countering that, like the... from Christos and Angelos was like the said contra to that.
Oh, yeah, that charity, if there's no reason, no intellect, and the influence of intellect on charity is not complete. Not prideful, doesn't say prideful.
Sorry, you were speaking fast and I was like, wait, go back.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me find the...
No, it's okay.
Yeah. If the intellect is not the one properly presiding over charity, then not only is it irrational and dark, but it is also not right to call it true charity. That's what it says. That it is incomplete. Therefore, it's not full, perfect charity that we Christians tend to.
The second question I had, during your presentation, I was very, well, obviously that was your thesis, but I was surprised at how similar, how do you pronounce his name? Cabasilas. How similar his positions were to St. Thomas as opposed to Palamas. And I specifically wanted to ask you to speak about how his ideas concerning like the vision of God or theosis would relate to not just Palamas, but kind of contemporary like person in the pew kind of ideas about like what it means to be able to achieve theosis or divinization in this life, versus only having like possibly little snippets of it.
Yes. Well, I think the other colleagues can answer you much better, but I'll make an effort and then they can say more and correct me if I'm wrong. Palamas and the Hesychasts considered that we are able to achieve vision of God, which means we become perfect in this life and we see the uncreated light, the light of Tabor. The problem is that Cabasilas is totally refuting this, that this is impossible because our nature is corrupt. And another thing is that if we are already divine or theoides, like we look, we become similar to God already in this life. What about charity, which is the most perfect virtue, and that God commands us to be perfect and also achieve full charity? There's no discussion about that. And another thing is, if let's say that Palamas and the others were believing that the divine rays do not go to each person equally, but God decides where and to whom person according to their disposition. Let's say someone is not able to achieve the divine light and therefore the perfection in the intellect. Can they achieve charity, which is actually what Christ commanded us to do? Perhaps this is a thing. That's my theory, so the others can correct me. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you for your presentation. Just to clarify, I'm certainly not well read in the different Palamite controversies, but I never heard what you said about Palamas' take on the Eucharist. So I didn't know if there was any more you could elaborate on that. But so we don't fully receive God in the Eucharist. I heard you say, so I'd be interested in.
Yeah, perhaps Professor Demetracopoulos, who's written about it, can explain it even better. Because he's the one who found it, so let's go to the source. We have the source here with us. So. We're lucky enough. The microphone, perhaps. Just...
I am not the source of your source.
Yeah.
So, well, according to the Palamite philosophical theology, it's metaphysically impossible to participate in what he calls the inaccessible God. When using the word essence or substance or whatever, in Greek, ousia, he denotes the part, the aspect of God, which is by definition impossible to participate. So even if you participate in the Holy Communion, this part of or aspect of God cannot be swallowed by you. This is metaphysically impossible. Just because you are a human being, just because you are a created being, just because you're not God, it's that simple. Still, this does not mean that you are away from God, or that you cannot participate in Him, because there is an infinitely and yet truly divine level, realm of God, which he calls energies. So when you participate in the grace of baptism, in the grace of the Eucharist, you participate in his energies. And this fully divinizes you, not in the sense that you become fully God, but you become, as Angelos said, theoides, namely something like God, which is the best which your nature allows you to achieve. Nikos Cabasilas rebuts this by saying that, hey, it's absurd to separate God to two or three or four, what I don't know how many aspects or bits of divinity, so to speak. So when you are participating in God via the Holy Communion, then what takes place is that you fully participate in God. So there's no reason to make any distinction between this or that part of God which you participate in. You just achieve what God's grace gives you because you would like to do that. You decide that you are a member of the church, and so you share in the grace of God by the church. And the image which Cabasilas uses, namely the disk, the sun as a disk, and the rays which are emanated from this disk, is very, very similar to the way in which Palamas describes God as a nucleus, so to speak, of energies which emanate his energies to us. And Cabasilas explicitly says, no, it's not the case that we participate only in the energies, but we swallow the disk itself. I think this is a very clear allusion by Cabasilas against what Palamas had so many times said, just 1-2 decades earlier.
Thank you. Question?
Sorry, at the danger of going down a rabbit hole, can I just ask a follow-up question? So when Palamas says that we can't metaphysically receive the essence, we can only receive the energy, he's not saying that Christ isn't completely metaphysically present in the Eucharist, right? He's just saying that we can only receive a part of it. Or is he saying that only the energy is present in the Eucharist?
No, he doesn't say so. He says that Jesus Christ is fully God, and in that sense, he stands as both the essence and the energy of God. But what he can bring to us is only the divine energies. Of course, the Palamites argued in the way you implicitly described, namely that this does not make sense. If something of God stays out of the real presence of God by Jesus Christ in this life, then the incarnation was not full or real or true. So they accused Palamism of even of Sabellianism, of Nestorianism, of course, even of Arianism and Eunomianism, namely that he excluded the possibility of the presence of the divine essence, nature of God in this life via the incarnation. And this was the basis for the further discussion regarding the Eucharist, because Eucharist, what's this mystery, this sacrament, is a prolongation of the presence of Jesus Christ on earth.
I have a question for Mr. Zaloumis. So I was struck, first of all, found it very interesting and persuasive of those passages from Aquinas and Cabasilas. So I was also struck in your projects on Secunda Secundae, and the great Thomist scholar Leonard Boyle, did a survey of manuscripts and found the Secunda Secundae was the portion of the Summa that was most copied and distributed. Yes. So I'm wondering, is it also among the Greek reception, Cabasilas, or others, also the section that's most used?
Great question. Thank you. In fact, this is the opposite. The most manuscript that survived to this day, the Summa Quadragentilis, of course, the Prima Pars, and the Prima Secunda. The Secunda is only, we have one 14th century manuscript in two codices because it's a huge text, Vaticanus Graecus 6:12 and Vaticanus Graecus 6:11. And we have a 15th century manuscript, which is partly copied by Gennadius himself, who keeps the full version of the text from question 165, and then there is an abridgment. Perhaps he didn't have the space or the paper. We have only that, because I think the most important, let's say, dogmatic differences between the two churches did not really, were not related to the issue of moral theology, where the Philoque emphasis and operates, essence of God and operations and other things. And I think in terms of moral theology, there are not so big differences. So I don't think they were too much interested in that. But that's what we know until now, because we don't even have the full translation in addition. I am preparing it. So if we don't have the original text, how can we look for influences and adaptation for reception of Thomas' moral theology in the late Byzantine world? And one more thing is that the texts are limited. I mean, there are not too many scholars like in the West, like flourishing and writing upon and commenting upon Thomas and other theologians and philosophers. It's an empire in decay. There are a couple of people who are very well trained in philosophy and theology and the letters in general, who are trying to discuss these things. It was just a group of people, limited group of people. Yeah, but I hope I can find more, so, on the reception of Secunda.
Thank you. So maybe now we can shift to kind of group questions, or if you have an individual person you'd like to ask a question of, but so either kind of for the group, the project as a whole, or for an individual person. So any questions?
So this is just sort of a question for Father Kappes. I'm just wondering that, so in the Middle Ages in England, the Franciscans started producing corriganda of the Summa. So they basically took the secunda and rewrote it to be volitional. And I was wondering, you mentioned, I can't pronounce his name, but how he started changing parts of the Summa contra Gentiles. Was that seen by the Palamites and the Hesychasts as a corriganda, or was that something he just sort of did silently and tried to pass off as Aquinas, his original thought?
Oh, we can just go ahead and call him George for the sake of ease. George, now Demetracopoulos has published the most on this, and I was fortunate that before this presentation that I reread a lot of his papers on this, but Scholarius advertises the fact that for his own purposes and for his ease of being able to carry around his books, among other things, he created this mini Summa contra Gentiles, let's say, and mini Summa Theologiae, which is, I think the Summa contra Gentiles, John would be able to correct me if I'm wrong, is about 1/6 the size of the actual book. And in this, it's for his own purposes that he's doing this. Now, some of the things that he is doing in this period is he is writing polemics, anything from against Islam to against a neo-pagan by the name of Gemistus Plethon. And so we can imagine that some of the purposes that he's using, he's going to use his Summa of the Summa contra Gentiles are for these purposes. But it does strike me as odd, because I believe it's to his preface of the Summa Theologiae, and John can correct me if I'm wrong, where he makes the mention that there are two things that divide, or maybe it is Summa contra Gentiles, there's two things that divide the Latin church from the Greek church. And the first is the Filioque, but the second is the essence energies controversy. And so what's interesting is even though he admits that, that we can now show that he differentiates the original, let's say, Editio Princeps, the first edition of the Summa contra Gentiles from Demetrius. He distorts it, so to speak, in order to be favorable towards Palamism, is kind of interesting, because the text now, as Gennadius has it, does not betray the fact that Thomas is irreconcilable, and he seemingly edited it for his own purposes. So I don't know that this is, and I think this might be John's own opinion, and I'll let John piggyback on this, but if this is just his own personal consultation text, he may have written it for himself, how he thinks of using Thomas, and therefore when he quotes from these summaries, he's going to use it in this format because he finds it useful instead of going back to Demetrius's format, which he would inevitably either have to disagree with or distort. John?
Well, what you said is absolutely accurate. He does say that these works were too bulky for him to carry from here to there and so on. But he also says that his intention was not so narrowly selfish, that he would like to be able to share the work with some others. So, yeah, I think sometimes he slightly adapts or expurgates what Aquinas says, but I would not say that he betrayed Aquinas. I mean, I had not noticed what you noticed and shared with us, namely that he inserted the small phrase "και ενέργεια." Well, I wouldn't say that Aquinas would disagree with that. If you say that God is και ενέργεια, namely actus, and energia and actus, this is not anti-Thomist, but of course you're right to think that this insertion had some meaning, unless it can be traced back to the original Greek text, the manuscript which he used, which is rather improbable. So he would like, I think in the end, after all, you're right, he tried to present Aquinas in a way that was both faithful to Aquinas and close to the official doctrine of the Eastern Church, provided it will be understood properly. This was his implicit footnote when he inserted this this small phrase, "και ενέργεια." This is what I think. Of course, we have to read the whole manuscript tradition, you know, and we must also check. We have no time to do right now. We must see if Πρόχορος Κιντώνας, in his treatise on the essence and energy, had inserted book one, Cotton Gentiles, book 1, chapter 32, which you quoted from, in his work, and see the exact way in which he quotes from that text. So that there is a long story before Scholarius, not that long, but a real story which we must trace out. But I was impressed by that. I mean, it was very, very smart on behalf of Scholarius and you, I think. Yeah.
Another question? Well, I have a question. So first of all, I knew very little about the Byzantine reception of Aquinas. I had looked at Marcus Plested's book several years ago that came out on the Byzantine reception of Aquinas. But so hearing more about it and your project, I find very exciting and interesting. And so some general questions I have is, like you mentioned how the historiography has changed dramatically over the past few days of those aware of this work, and even in the past few years. So, like, could you say a bit about what the before and after is? Like, what was the story 50 years ago? Was there any awareness of this reception of Aquinas? You know, what was out there? And then the other question related is, who else is being received? Like, I was surprised to see Francis Mayron showing up. What other figures are like medieval figures are showing up? And connected to that, is there any evidence any of these Byzantine scholars studied or spent time in Western universities? So
I'd like to defer to John for the general picture, since he reads all of our works and provides us kind of with the unifying kind of communications between us. So he's always up to date on what everybody's doing. And then if I think that he left anything behind with regard to my specialization, then I'll get to talk about some very particulars. So John, and I'm sorry to speak on behalf of Angelos, but I'll go ahead and defer to either one of you.
50 years ago, well, there were, let's say, dozen of articles and 3-4 books on this issue. But the biggest problem was, and partly still is, that all this bulky stuff of the Greek translations of Aquinas were and still are unpublished or are being published right now. So I think that scholarship was prudent when deciding to be silent regarding this issue, because the primary evidence was not available. Nowadays, we can see that both the quantity and the quality of Aquinas' thought was quite impressive when at least for the Byzantines who were able to access it. Even the quantity, the bare quantity of the Thomas Graecus, of the entirety of Aquinas' text, which were translated into Greek, equals the entire philosophical and theological literature produced by that time by the Byzantines. Half of the Greek Byzantine, of the late Byzantine philosophical and theological literature is Aquinas, is Thomas Graecus. It was funny when I discovered that, and this is just numbers, you know. So it was actually impossible for scholars to trace out what went on regarding the reception of these authors. That's why Angelos is absolutely right when emphasizing the necessity of producing these editions of these translations. And besides Aquinas, we do have some translations of writings by St. Anselm. The Cur Deus Homo, the De Vocationis Spiritus Sancti, and the Epistola de Asmo Fermentato were translated by Manuel Kalekas or Demetrios Kidones. I'm not quite sure about the Cur Deus Homo. We're trying to establish a new project regarding the Anselmus Byzantinus with collaboration with the University of Ghent in Belgium. We'll see if we will be able to carry that out. We also have some translations of Boethius' Consolatio Philosophiae, Boethius' De Trinitate. And we have many small parts of major authors. We do know that thanks to Chris, first of all. I mean, nobody knew anything about the reception of Francis of Marion, for example. Or almost nobody knew a lot about the reception of Herveus Natalis, whose commentary on the sentences was part translated by Prochoros Kidones, the brother of Demetrius Kidones. The list is longer than that, but it's still too early to produce a full list. So we have to wait. And Scholarius was the richest of all. I think his reception of scholastic thought was much richer than we knew. And we do know that thanks to Chris' second dissertation in Thessaloniki. So we do need scholars to produce editions the next 10, 20 years, you know. And the image which will emerge will be radically richer and more accurate than what we have achieved so far.
I would only add to that very briefly that there's I mean, if we look at it from a philosophy of science point of view, that there's oftentimes, even in very radically changing environments, a traditionalism and a resistance to change. I think that that's true in the humanities when it comes to Byzantinists, particularly when many of them emanate from countries that have a certain cultural investment in ways of thinking. For example, there's a lot of investment in Greek universities, myself being a graduate of one, in resisting Thomas Aquinas or Augustine being central figures, not just interesting footnotes, but central figures in celebrated Orthodox theologians' production, intellectually, creativity, ways of framing an argument. And I think that we won't see, I think, in a lot of published texts from all directions this until the Thomas de Aquino Byzantino scholars just publish such a large amount of peer-reviewed literature that one would look even in a kind of textbook or history manual or theological manual, one would look like they are absolutely omitting large portions of history. So, I mean, our project right now is still in the process of taking all these Latin authors who are integral to the intellectual production of great Orthodox minds and saints, and putting out slight English translations, Greek editions, so that it just becomes apparent that Aquinas's centrality to late Byzantine thought means that there is a new way in which both Catholic and Orthodox dialogue, Catholic and Orthodox scholars are going to have to look at late Byzantium, particularly if individuals are people that have a Orthodox confession of faith. They're going to have to reconcile themselves to the reality that the attitudes that are currently predominant, even among scholars, perhaps more against Aquinas than for him, do not represent their forefathers.
Thank you. Any other questions?
May I add a short comment?
Yes.
Just for a while. If most modern Greek Orthodox theologians are reluctant to recognize, to confess Aquinas' influence on the late Byzantine thought, I suspect that the modern Catholic theologians are not interested in that. I mean, they have their own tradition and traditions, a very rich tradition, so that they feel that Byzantium is something marginal or exotic. And since the dialogue between the two churches has now a new agenda, not the agenda of the early or even the mid 20th century, then nobody cares. I mean, nothing can be, from the ecclesiastical point of view and the ecumenical point of view, nothing can be establish itself as useful. Nothing scholarly, I mean, can establish itself as useful in the context of the discussion of the churches, of the Catholic and the Orthodox. Scholarship is here, and the churches are there. This was not the case in the early 20th century, where giants like Martin Suzy produced so deep and extensive scholarly work.
Thank you.
Can I have a last remark?
Please.
I would just want to say that if I didn't have transcribed the Secunda, so I have it in the PDF, I can look for terms and words. And if I didn't have the draft of the Prima Secunda, given me by assistant professor now, Demetracopoulos, who was in the group, I wouldn't be able to make this presentation, because I wouldn't be able to look for all these things. So that's the necessity and importance of editions and having the text to speak about things. Thank you.
Thank you. Any final question? Yes.
Sorry, Father Kappes, you mentioned that there's a resistance to a new paradigm where St. Thomas isn't viewed as like the prime enemy of the East, that like, do you find that that is an active kind of animosity or more of a latent kind of, like when you talk to other scholars or theologians or even just fellow priests, like, do you get a lot of pushback? Are people open to it, or do they feel really reticent to accept anything that would seem like I don't know, compromising their kind of perceived identity? Or I know I get a lot of pushback when I say that I'm a Thomist and I'm Ukrainian Catholic, and they're like, oh, then you must not really be Eastern. I'm like, okay, thanks, bye. So I wanted to know your your experience, like in different churches, in different settings, academically, or in different countries.
Sure. I'll try to give a very brief summation because I would like to hear Angelos and John's contemporary experience because I've been out of Greece for about 10 years physically, like I was living there, and I only visit places now. But I would say that historically, when it comes to ecclesiastical figures who may be involved in promoting things within the Orthodox churches officially by, let's say, being the editor of a journal or being on a international dialogue team, I think that John is correct that there's generally a lack of interest by scholars, mainly because it's specialist, it's hard work. I think there's an impression that we're past all that, like the Juji thing didn't work. Now we want to talk about things from a different perspective of agreement. But when it comes to actual academe that that are simply publishing scientific literature for tenure, for their passion, whatever it is that their purposes other than dialogue with the churches. My experience has been is that they have no point of reference to talk about this. And so they wouldn't be able to make scholastic distinctions even based off of manuscripts. They wouldn't really know what's out there. They're very, very invested in really literature that's been published since I would say the 1950s and 60s, as if that view of scholasticism being antithetical to orthodoxy and the narrative that has subsequently kind of been regurgitated again and again in different languages, that's really the talking point. You know, there's a chasm between orthodoxy and scholasticism. That chasm can't be overcome. And they're not really, this is my experience, which is anecdotal. It's not a statistical survey, but that there is just an unwillingness to kind of engage in that. I can remember one scholar who represents, I think, a journal on the Holy Mountain of the Central Orthodoxy that I was talking about with Herveus and Natalis. And his response was to just kind of blow me off in a conversation. And then only later when I publish an article in a friendly way, trying to begin a little bit of a challenge, maybe to get some interest, and simply writing an article against me that I was arrogant, which he probably has my sin right, but he didn't actually address the arguments, which are that that scholasticism is really integral to any topic that has to do with Palamism, and that Palamites were, to whatever degree, a reluctant degree, but still influenced by Thomas, even if only negatively, which I wouldn't say represents at all right now the majority. We're still in theory with our history of Palamism, but probably most of them had several things that they were negatively reacting to, but a lot of things that they were very attracted to with their own contemporary issues. So the final thing that I'll say is I wish that we had more Eastern Catholics, Ukrainian Catholics, interested in this, because part of seminary education and part of university education in the so-called universities and churches would greatly benefit from being able to see that their Eastern Catholic identity can be very well reconciled with the 14th, 15th century movements in Byzantium. And in fact, it would be contemporary orthodoxy that has too many intellectual aporiae, too many intellectual puzzles that can't be solved with their current stance culturally on learning from the West, because really what Eastern Catholicism is trying to do now was already done by Eastern Orthodox in the 14th and 15th centuries, and they felt, to whatever degree, each one individually, rather comfortable with adopting Western theology as a benefit to being able to think about God. So that would be my final word. And then I kind of turn things over to I think it's Angelos.
John first, if Professor Demetracopoulos wants to be first before me.
How do you find the
I think it's
contemporary
okay.
scene now in Greece, John, as well as the other places?
Well, I can multiply your examples. So I don't know if this is statistically professional, but but yes, the reactions are like that. We waver, at least in Greece, between hostility and indifference. And this is a mark of lacking scholarly conscience. We're not committed to the historical truth. This is a worldwide problem, I think, but some underdeveloped, academically underdeveloped countries, like many Balkan countries are, I think that the problem is huger and deeper. So yes, I have had the same experience and during the last 3 decades. I don't care that much because this is not a properly scholarly issue. I'm only interested in that because I think that discussing about these issues in a non-professional way, but at the same time in a staunch way, establishes some kind of bad mentality, which discourages people to get involved into these issues in the proper way, which is the scholarly way, which means philology, history of philosophy, and history of theology. That's why I'm happy to have all of you as collaborators. We're not that many, but you meet the standards, and we're going ahead. This is the point.
I personally have a couple of interesting stories, which should not be put on record, so I can share with you later in the break. Yeah, but only one about the state of denial. One metropolitan bishop in the Church of Greece, who is supposed to be one of the intellectuals in the Greek Orthodox tradition. When I met him, I won't say the name, I told him that I do a PhD under the supervision of Professor Demetracopoulos. He went straight to the point and told me, I disagree with your supervisor. I said, okay, what about it? And he was like, it's not about Thomas Aquinas, but Augustine in Palamas. He was like, I think that the 150 chapters, it's a work by Palamas, was not actually authored by Palamas, but it's from Scholarios, George, 15th century. Because Palamas, he was an Orthodox and he could not be influenced by Augustine. The fact is that one of the oldest manuscripts we have of the text are perhaps when Palamas was still alive or some years later. It's a 14th century manuscript, and this bishop was very certain that this is a 50th century work and is misattributed. So that's a state of denial. I smiled and I nodded. I didn't want to disagree with such a thing, but that's one story that I can tell you. And others are more funny than that.
You're sure to know that I'm not weird.
No. I was probably... No.
Well, thank you very much for a very stimulating panel, and let's thank our panelists once again.